Mechanism of enzyme action. Mechanism of enzyme action refers to the way an enzyme acts on a substrate. Let's say this substrate right here binds with enzyme E. Once the substrate binds with enzyme E, it forms an enzyme substrate complex. The enzyme brings about changes in the substrate and finally forms a product. The enzyme remains as it is because it is a biocatalyst, and catalysts are those substances that don't take part in the chemical reaction directly. Instead, it just brings some kind of change in the rate of the chemical reaction. Okay, so here's the thing. The substrate binds with enzyme and forms enzyme substrate complex. The enzyme brings about changes in the substrate to form a product. The mechanism of enzyme action depends on this first reaction. That is, on the basis of how the enzyme binds with the substrate to form enzyme substrate complex, there have been proposed two models explaining mechanism of enzyme action. And these two models are number one, lock and key model, which is also called a rigid template model, and it has been proposed by Emil Fischer. And number two, induced fit model, which is also called hand in glove model, which has been proposed by Daniel E. Kosland. And it is really simple to understand both of these models because the explanation of these models have been given by the name of the models themselves. So let's look at both of them one by one. First is the lock and key model, which is also called the rigid template model. In this particular model, there's your substrate. This substrate binds with the enzyme and forms the enzyme substrate complex. The site of the enzyme where the substrate binds to is called the active site of the enzyme. And the active site of the enzyme in this particular model, as you can see, has a pre-shaped structure. That is, it has a definite structure or a rigid pre-shaped structure. And only those substrate that can exactly fit in this particular pre-shaped structure can bind with the enzyme to form the enzyme substrate complex. So only complementary substrate to this active site can bind and form enzyme substrate complex. So the active site has a rigid pre-shaped structure and the active site is complementary to that of the substrate. The reason it is called lock and key model is because the enzyme and the substrate act as lock and key. Just the way a key fits in a particular type of lock that is complementary to the key. Similarly, the substrate binds to particular active site that is complementary to it. It is called rigid template model because the active site where the substrate binds to has a rigid precept structure. So this is the lock and key model. Second is induced fit model or hand in glove model. So here's the substrate, here's the enzyme, the substrate binds with the enzyme and forms enzyme substrate complex. The site where the substrate binds to is the active site. As you can see, the active site does not have a fixed structure. It is flexible. That is, it can change. And it changes depending on the surface of the substrate itself. So it is the substrate that brings conformational change, that is change in shape. So when this substrate comes in contact with the enzyme, at the active site, the change in the structure of the surface takes place so that the substrate can fit or bind with the enzyme. The reason it is called induced fit model is because it is the surface of the substrate that induces change at the active site, shape of the active site, so that the substrate can fit at that particular place, so called induced fit model. It is called hand in glove model because as soon as you enter your hand into a glove, the glove takes the shape of your hand. Similarly, as soon as this substrate comes in contact with the enzyme, the active site of the enzyme takes the shape of this particular surface of the substrate. and that's why it's also called the hand-in-glove model. Let me revise the whole thing for you. So, mechanism of enzyme action. The substrate binds with enzyme to form enzyme substrate complex. The enzyme brings about changes in the substrate to form product. The mechanism of enzyme action depends on the way enzyme substrate complex is formed, and there are two different models explaining it. The first is the lock and key model or rigid template model, and the second is the induced fit model or hand in glove model. According to lock and key model, the active site where the substrate binds to has a rigid pre-shaped structure and it is complementary to the substrate. So only the substrate that whose surface can exactly fit at this particular place can bind with the enzyme. Second is induced fit model, where the active site where the substrate binds to is flexible and does not have a fixed structure. It is the substrate that brings about change at the active site so that the substrate can bind with the enzyme.